wrap up world building with a couple of special things I want to highlight. So this is more some in-depth tips and tricks. Some of them really small, some of them are just kind of fun things or things you probably should know. Not always typically immediately obvious, and I wish someone would have told me this. So we're going to look at these 5: level organization, cleanliness, landscapes, foliage, and painting tools. A few more things to highlight there that weren't covered in the schematic or are more specific. So this is the way that we've typically worked, that I've been working for the last 20 years, I think, building worlds. So I'm going to highlight this. When you look at important actor standards, what I tend to do, and this goes into a whole discussion about the outliner, which we've had many times.
Yeah.
Yes. But what I tend to do is I place the important actors in some central location underneath each other or next to each other, it doesn't matter. And you can also, by the way, you can change the billboard scale. So you can make the icons larger in the world. So you make little groups. So what we do is we visually organize the scene in the scene. That's what I do. That's opposed to using the outliner. Well, not necessarily opposed, but you can see what I've done here.
Can be complementary.
Yes, yes, probably be, sure. But what I've done here, I didn't use the outliner. You can obviously use the outline. You could create folders in here. You can start grouping it by saying, here's a folder with all the lights and all the geometry, and you can do that.
And also layers.
With the layers, you can do that. And it's just the way you wish to work. But from a historical point of view, the outline has never been there until, I believe, when we launched Unreal Engine 4, 5.5 years or something, or 6 years ago, or whatever it was now. Right? It was never there before that. So a lot of people have been using Unreal for longer. They don't necessarily use that. For me, this is a search box, but again, you use it entirely as you see fit. But what I do, and you can work as you see fit, but it's important to understand all the possibilities you have in front of you, okay? So I organize it visually in the scene by changing editor billboard scale and doing that, but then it comes down to the selection tools too, okay? The groups, the layers, and the selection tools, and the power that they offer. So we have standard grouping in the engine. This one is easy. You select things, Ctrl-G, it's now a group. Hooray, that's easy, right? Ctrl-Shift-G temporarily disables the group while keeping the group. Shift-G would actually fully kill the group and just split it up again.
Just to say that doesn't change the way those actors are going to be rendered.
And it doesn't change the outliner.
Yeah.
Okay, and that again, you have to understand the history of the Unreal Engine to understand why it didn't change the outliner, because well, we didn't necessarily use the outliner before, so therefore it's not reflected in it anymore. Like, they didn't connect the dots. Okay, so that's where that comes from. But there is one thing called layers, which is actually not layers, and it's been called layers since at least 15 years, and it's not layers, but they are still cool. So there's this panel here called layers, and it gives you this. Now, these things, I've got a couple of examples here. If I do this, it hides the pillars in the room. If I do this, it hides something, I'm not sure what. Oh, actually, it's connected to the two, I think, see? And this is why it's not truly layers. So you can use this to hide and toggle things on and off, depending on what you're doing. But it's primarily nothing more than a selection set. It's a saved selection. You double-click it, it selects it. You double-click that one, it selects that one. It also means that one mesh can be in 2 different layers at the same time, or 50 different layers at the same time. So it's really fun to just make little selection sets. It's nothing more than a saved selection. It's not a layer. In no way, but we should really rename that at some point, I think. But the selection tools. The selection tools are all the different ways that you can select things in Unreal. This would have been one of them, but you can also always right-click anything and select everything that is all the immediate children. You can do all the select matching meshes. So this is going to select all the pillars in the level, right? And there is so much stuff in these kind of menus that you can use to quickly control the level. So rather than placing heavy emphasis on the outliner to bring structure and control to maybe 10,000, 20,000 different things in the world, I use this, and that's the original way. These kind of tools, you can do this in the content browser too. If I do Ctrl-B, I go to a content browser, I right-click that mesh, I can also here do select actors using this asset. Now I also selected all the pillars based on what I have selected in the content browser. And that's really cool too. And the statistics panel that you've seen earlier does the same thing. Go back to statistics. You can say here, I want to select the statue. I'm going to do 7 actors. It gives me, it zooms out a bit, but it gives me the 7 statues in the level. instantly. And all of that gives me control. I mean, we had a discussion at some point where you said, no, then how do you do this? And I did it in 5 seconds.
Well,
so,
but I want it organized in my workload client.
So you can
I'm a programmer.
Yes, so you can choose how you want to work and how you can continue, but just understand there's a lot of stuff in there to control the level. Good. Just really basic, this one. Just want to iterate on it because I see a lot of people kind of skipping on this. The Unreal Engine has snapping tools standard enabled and integrated for things. There's a grid snapping here, rotation snap and scale snap. Please use them. I think that from a production point of view, building worlds, that really helps because it's really annoying to take over a level from someone else if the meshes are not on grid. That doesn't mean they always have to be perfectly on grid, but in general, it makes it easier to move things around because you don't have to try to try to align things. When they're rotated and you're trying to rotate them back, you don't have to try to rotate them like, find the right measures again or type numbers. It will just snap. It speeds up production. Same for scaling. So,
and I think that in the editor setting, you can customize the values of the snapping. For example, once I had to put pillars in walls, and to do that, I just measured the distance of the wall and use that distance to automatically snap. I know that you can snap to vertex also, but I wanted to do
I don't think that feature works particularly well, so I'd rather not go there. But yes, you technically can. And this is a totally somewhat unrelated tip that is related. Unreal, because of the viewport controls, it's sometimes easy to accidentally move things. If you hold Control and you click and drag, you actually move the meshes using shortcuts, which is not a really fun thing. It's the original way of moving, and it's very, very fast. There's a lot of advantages. But it does mean that if you hold Control and you try to select multiple things at the same time, there is a chance that as you slightly drag the mouse, as you click multiple things, and you've slightly moved them. That does then happen. So what I do is I always use the square bracket. What do you call them correctly in English? Square brackets? Okay.
Don't ask me.
The square brackets. What do you call them?
Brackets.
Brackets. But I don't mean the round ones, right? So
those are parentheses.
That thing. If you do that, you increase the grid size. You can see the number is going up. It's now at 10,000 all the way over here. So I tend to do very big grids. Then I can't accidentally move it anymore with Control. Then select things and then quickly bring it back down. It's just a quick tip. Oh, and by the way, shadows and collision, turn them off when you don't need them on certain things. It will help cleanliness and slightly with performance. Like the sky, for example, shouldn't have a shadow, obviously, nor have collision. Loading and collision, a bit faster on the landscape. So as mentioned, it will automatically lot, simplify rather. This is set in the settings of the landscape. I typically increase the loading distance a bit more. It's by default it's set very, very subtle. I make it more aggressive and saves a tiny bit of performance. So you can do that. There is also the fact that this can be set, that you can change the collision, and all of this can be done per component, which is an important thing to note. So in here it will say collision, let me bring that back up, collision lot somewhere, or MIP map I think it says. Can't seem to find. Collision MIP level. If you set it to 1, you get lower precision collision. You get, the rougher terrain. Works well for fairly flat landscapes. Saves a considerable amount of memory. And you can do that per component. So if I select, for example, a particular component, I say that one, I can change that just for that one component. In fact, I can even change the material for just one component in the landscape and simplify that material for distant stuff or stuff that's less important. There are shared samplers, so the landscapes in Unreal can support up to 128 textures through a shared sampler, which is not there by default, but if you have a landscape material, then there's a texture here, and here is sampler source from texture asset. But if that were to be set to a shared sampler, you can have 128 textures in there. By default, you're only going to have 12 or 13 or something like that. There's that. Think in general about the material complexity of a landscape material because it is going to be rendered across the whole landscape. Unreal tries to do it fairly intelligently, but nonetheless, it's a challenge to render. So what Unreal will do is, for each of these sections of landscape, it generates a material instance that only has those materials enabled that it needs, or those textures enabled that it needs. So if you look in the material, you can see we've got this one, and this one. If you paint the, if you start painting grass on one square, it's going to create a material instance that has grass textures enabled, but not the other ones. So it creates a simplified shader that only has exactly what it needs. If you then paint the gravel, it's going to modify that instance and also add that to it. So it tries to build up the complexity as is needed. Nonetheless, the complexity in this quickly goes crazy. So just be a little bit conservative as you can.
And it's going to be in most of the pixels in the screen.
Yeah.
Because the landscape is huge, usually.
Also, yeah. So it's something to consider. There is distance, fading, scale, and textures. This is just a trick. It's not really a feature. It's just something I like doing, and I like telling people that I do it, so I'm going to do exactly that. But as you move away here, this might be slightly, I'm going to do this without lighting, maybe it's better. See, as you move away, there is actually a fade happening right there between the textures and what is essentially a giant texture that I just rendered in an external program, which is this one right there. So that is just rendered and imported as is. The other ones are the individual layers. And what I tend to do to prevent the landscape from looking very tiley, like you see all the tiling of the textures in the distance, it's fading over to this macro texture in a distance and this up close. So if you're at camera perspective, you get this. You see over here, there's no rocks there. It gets more smooth. So you get just a nice little transition. You can also do this with normal maps and other things. And we're doing nothing more than pixel depth. We scale that and we lerp that on top of it. It's a very simple little thing. It doesn't take much performance except the extra texture in the material. And lastly, lesser well known as well, but Unreal supports hard blends between layers. So typically if you paint in Unreal on a landscape, you get this very soft transition. And if I remember correctly, somewhere here, right, so I paint this little gray areas just to illustrate it. Normally you get this soft transition here. Doesn't look very good. You are able to define an alpha texture and get a more of a hard, heavy transition going, if that's what if that's desired. And we can see this here too. How it was done is actually very simple. There is, this one has an alpha texture in it. That is just the, the pattern that we're using, the mask that we're using. And this layer thing, which combines them together, I think it's number 2. It's set to, I think that one is different. You change the blend type. So you can find back. Can't seem to find where the pebbles are. Can't find where the pebbles are. Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. One is set to weight blend and the other one is set to height blend, as you can see. So here is the hard blend set to height, then you use the alpha, that's it. And almost there now, foliage asset. Instead of adding, because when you use the foliage panel over here, it's actually very simple to work with. You just drag the mesh in it. It's going to say, do you want to save it? But if you say no, then you've directly assigned the static mesh as a foliage thing you can paint, but it's still a static mesh. But what you can do is you can save that as a foliage asset, and that's exactly what we've done, if I remember correctly, for the tree. So you see this is a foliage asset or a foliage type, and it's the same thing. So it's just the settings as you had them in the foliage paint tool panel, but the settings saved in an asset. So if you go to a different level, you can paint with the exact same settings. If you modify them here, all the levels change and makes it much more scalable across content.
And also the grass will use that.
Yeah, and the grass layer must use that. So this must have an asset like that.
Yeah.
Anyway. And range and shadow, the foliage can be quite heavy, especially with shadows. So try to turn off shadows if you don't really need it. Like don't give grass shadows or small rocks. I mean, it's pointless. The range as well, try to keep the, the rendering range down. You can define the cutoff point for grass, like at what point it stops rendering. Obviously set it. If you don't set it, which is by default not set, it's going to render forever. Not a good idea. And then there's 2 things that I do, especially to help with the range. I do this lower position material trick that I started using about 5 years ago. I've got this little test setup over here that shows it more easily because it's a white background. See, there's grass there. Normally, if grass disappears, in a distance, it just disappears. It's just instantly gone. It's very ugly. It doesn't work. But if you do this trick over here, you can see it's actually going to sink into the ground. So you're not fading it, because then you would have translucent grass. That would be a bad idea. There's no dirter transition either. That's also weird. But I'm just sinking it into the ground. So the grass goes into the ground, and then it's gone. And then I can color it. And this is a very simple material thing. So it's these kind of simple things that really, you know. So these are two different features here, by the way, but the one we're dealing with is just this. Object position vs camera position, and we multiply the distance. We subtract a little bit of a dead zone in front. We clamp it for safety. That's it. Grass is sinking into the ground.
Just a tip, you can do distance squared instead of distance, and it's going to be cheaper.
Programmer. So. And similar for the slope material trick, this is actually from my colleague Aaron, so credit to him, but he brought this to my attention, and it's actually a really fun one. Because normally if you have a piece of grass, and this is a pretty big mesh, it's probably too big for its own good, but if you just place it on the slope, it's going to do this. That doesn't work. You see grass sticking out. You see this in a lot of games as well, typically. You could align the grass to the angle of the surface. That happens a lot, but then the grass grows sideways. Grass doesn't grow sideways. It doesn't do it. I mean, nature grows up because it goes up. So that doesn't work either. So this approach here is the best of both, because it's aligned to the surface and the grass actually grows up. It's a very simple trick as well, where essentially we took a mesh. You can see what the mesh is doing here. I had the mesh in here. If you rotate it, it keeps trying to point up, depending on how you rotate it. Super simple trick, but it's these kind of things where Unreal really shines, where you can experiment and mess with these things and see what happens. If I assign any other material to it, you see what happens. It's actually compressed. This is the mesh. It's flattened. And if you look, what that means is it's got vertex colors applied, and then it's been scaled down, so it's very compressed. The vertex color identifies which vertices should be brought back up, which should be scaled up, and the material scales them up dependent on the same material we just had, dependent on it's just the normal. So we change the world position offset and we just make it go up depending on the vertex color. That's it. This is all it does. Actually only this. Very simple one. Cool. And just highlighting the fact that we have these, I'm not going to say much more about them, but there are painting tools. They're standard integrated into the engine as anything else. Bit of a strange setup over here. Actually, I can start with this one. For example, you have a mesh, you want to paint some tiles away with dirt. There's a painting tool here that allows you to do exactly that, as you see. So I can paint on the mesh. I'm painting vertex colors in this case, and the material has been set up to show me, to blend the two on top of it, depending on the color applied. You can also paint textures, which is, I believe, what we've done with this mesh. So you can, it automatically recognizes the textures in here. For example, you got pond, that's the alpha texture used. And if I paint that, it actually unpaints this, or paints it back, depending on what you do. It even increases the height a little bit. So even this, and all of this is nothing more than just me painting on this texture. And this mesh is nothing more than a standard subdivided plane. See, this is the mesh. It's subdivided, so I can paint on it, but that's it. And the material is doing all the work, because the material is that thing. Okay. You can see there's an arrow here, because we haven't opened this in a while, so that shouldn't be there. Obviously, that's just because it's set to the wrong, should be set to linear, but that's it.
Okay, my question is on light mass importance volumes. With the advent of ray tracing technology, are light mass importance volumes still relevant? Are they? Are they important in the process in general, or do you have to use them? And in particular with ray tracing.
Let's widen the question. Do you have to use light mass importance volumes if all the lighting is dynamic? No, I don't think you do. No, I don't think there's any reason. No. So yeah, if by extension, if you only use ray tracing, then all the lighting is dynamic. Therefore, no, you don't need a light mass importance volume. It's really only meant for the pre-computation. If the lighting gets baked, then the light mass importance volume is there, must be there. Anyway, technically, it works if it's not there, but yeah, don't do that.
Anyway, the ray tracing is not for everything right now. So if you, for example, have characters and you don't want to use the ray tracing for characters and sets, you still need that computation, and you still need the volume.
And my last question is on level streaming and use of sublevels. When you're working in a distributed work environment where you have different people working on different levels, and you have this, I think you mentioned the concept of kind of like the master level or the persistent level. Are the people working in the other levels working in a specific world offset location, or is there like a level designer who's going to bring in those levels and then place the objects, place the assets from the other levels in this master level? So, you know, essentially are the other artists that are working on the sub-levels working in a specific location, if that makes sense.
I mean, the two levels can share the same location. So there's no problem with that. As he showed, when you make invisible one level, the other things that are in that location will appear. So typically what you will do, it's at the beginning you do the white box, and then you decide in that white box how the streaming is going to happen. And once you have that, and you have separated in regions, so to say the world, those regions you will create one map for the environment of that region, one for the gameplay, one for the sound, one for the and such. So a gameplay designer assigned to a region can work on that region, but at the same time the environment artist can work also on that region. So they don't be separated by regions, but being separated by, let's say, discipline, you can work in the same region at the same time. Okay.